Okay, now I'm going to briefly go over the three most popular forms of synthesis that musicians currently use: subtractive, FM, and wavetable. Subtractive synthesis is basically taking an audio source and changing the timbre with a filter. Yes, it's really that simple. So let me give you an example. If I go wah, 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 I just did subtractive synthesis. My voice is the audio signal and my mouth is filtering it. Subtractive synthesis using actual circuits and like knobs and stuff was developed in the 1960s and perfected in the 1970s. Up until the 1980s, all the components were analog, so that limited the kind of filters you could use and the kind of waveforms you could use. So you could pretty much only use like a low pass or a high pass filter, and waveforms were just really simple stuff like square waves, sawtooth waves, triangle waves, etc. When I mention that detail, all analog, or most, if not all analog synths are subtractive synths, but not all subtractive synths are analog. And then to further confuse things, if you've got VSTs that are analog modeling, they could theoretically do more, but they've decided to kind of limit it to what the old analog synths could do so that it just gets that kind of retro feel. So the first popular commercial subtractive synth was the Mini Moog, developed by Bog Moog Industries. If you look at the design of it, you can see we've got three oscillators, basic waveforms, a mixer section, a low-pass filter, a basic envelope, and a pitch bend knob, and a mod wheel. I believe synth manufacturers had a mod wheel before, but the Mini Moog was the first one with a pitch bend, and everyone has been using them ever since. Yeah, if you look at this and you've seen like Diva VST or Silent, yeah, the design is frighteningly similar. That's because like Bob Moog was kind of a great synth designer, and so most subtractive synths kind of follow this basic design because he killed it right out of the gate. I gave you the whole history lesson, but too long didn't read. Subtractive synthesis, sound source, filter. All right, next up we have FM synthesis, which is short for frequency modulation. So you have your oscillator, which is a carrier signal, and then you have the modulating signal, which is going to modulate the frequency of the carrier signal. And if you do that fast enough, it isn't perceived as, say, a pitch LFO, and it's perceived as a completely new sound in timbre that's basically the same fundamental pitch. Let me demonstrate that for you, because it's kind of complicated and unintuitive, but once you can kind of see it visually, it makes sense. So right now, I have a sine wave and I have a low frequency oscillator assigned to the pitch. So at really slow, it sounds like if you've ever done this in a synth, like what it should sound like. So you perceive it as one sound moving up and down in pitch. Now, as I speed this up, now your ear perceives it, it is, in practice, an entirely different waveform that's much more complex. And so with just this basic example, you can already get a very complicated waveform. When you start extrapolating the concept to multiple carriers, multiple modulators, multiple oscillators, and you throw in a couple of envelopes, you can create incredibly complex waveforms. This was all patented by Yamaha in the early 1980s, and the first mass-produced synth that used frequency modulation was the Yamaha DX7. It was also one of the first digital synths and probably the most popular synth of all time. It sold something like 200,000 units, and at about, I think it was like a $2,000 sticker price, they made a lot of money with the DX7. There was also, throughout the mid-'80s, they did simpler versions of it. If you start to look, all it really had was this little tiny digital readout, so it was notoriously hard to program. If you, say, go on YouTube and type DX7 presets and listen to presets, you're going to hear every single 80s song you've ever heard, like all those synth sounds or just the basic synth sounds. And they also sold, I believe, some ROMs with extra patches. And you don't really find anyone doing, like musicians themselves, doing a lot of DX7 programming. I mean, there were guys who were just DX7 programmers, and you could just have a whole like profession of just programming DX7 back in the 80s because it was kind of impossible. Yamaha's patent ran out in 1995, so you start to see that like things, FM synthesis kind of picked up again back in like the mid-2000s with FM8. Ableton's got an operator synth that's somewhat modeled after the DX7. In fact, if you look right here on the photo, it had it's had certain prefab arrangements of how the different oscillators were linked together with carrier modulator. And if you pull up Ableton's operator, it's got the same different little block connections of carrier and modulator. So just your too long, didn't read to conclude. FM synthesis is just frequency modulation. The frequency of a modulator changes the pitch or frequency of the carrier wave. Next, let's do wavetable synthesis. Wavetable synthesis is a form of sample-based digital synthesis. Your oscillator has a table of different samples or waveforms, static waveforms, and then using envelopes or LFOs, you cycle through that and kind of create organic morphing textures. Let me give you an example of that. So here we have a basic alien spectral wavetable. Hit the key. And as we cycle through, it kind of morphs. And if we look and we click again, we can see the individual cycles and how it interpolates between them. So that's the difference between Wavetable is a form of digital sampling synthesis, but not all digital sampling synths are wavetable. If I just play one note and then I play a different note at a different point in the wavetable, that's just digital sampling synthesis. It's when you're morphing between them that makes the wavetable. The first commercial wavetable synthesizer was the Waldorf PPG. It was released in 1981. And it was on a lot of popular records, like David Bowie used one, Aha used one. It didn't really reach the popularity of the Yamaha DX7, mainly because of the price tag. It was about 10 grand. And later versions of the PPG, you had to buy peripherals that you could create your own wavetables and edit them. It became more popular in the late 2000s, early 2010s with computers and VSTs because, as you can see, this is a little tiny screen and it's very hard to see what's going on. But if you have a computer and endless sampling hard drive space and a great graphic user interface, it becomes very easy to use and very intuitive. And so that's the basic overview of wavetable synthesis. So we've covered FM, frequency modulation, carrier, modulator, and wavetable, where we have a large table of samples. So that's a basic overview of subtractive, FM, and wavetable synthesis. Next, we're going to go into an overview of Serum's menus.